HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Sit Room in the Theater of War and Peace by David Scheffer, read by Joe Barrett. Situation Room. They gather during the day, they assemble in the night, these men and women of war and peace, invested with intelligence briefings, dire forecasts of military brass, and scheming of politicians. They act as diplomats and generals on the fields of reality. Look, down there in the Situation Room of the West Wing at the White House, the dungeon below all the fun. The deputies and principals roll the dice with every ruling of their minds. David Scheffer, 2018. Introduction. I always felt I was entering the most important room in Washington, indeed sometimes the world, when I walked through the sit-room door. David Scheffer. January 20th, 2018. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the day, but precisely 25 years earlier, when one corner of the globe, the Balkans in Southeast Europe, was consuming itself with hatred, I stepped into the middle of that war and its atrocities. I was neither soldier nor humanitarian worker. No act of valor catapulted me. I was an international lawyer, age 39, who found himself entering the halls of power in Washington and being thrust into the Balkans conflict from afar with a daily tasking. How does the great and powerful United States, under a new president's leadership, handle this abomination? Just as a later generation of policymakers cogitated year after year what to do about Syria after its people were thrown into the fires of hell in 2011, I was facing years of cables, memoranda, emails, intelligence reports, Washington and United Nations briefings, European journeys, and above all, meetings in the White House Situation Room to deliberate what to do about the ravaging of Bosnia and Croatia. The experience resembled a roller coaster ride that dipped and rose on the backs of hundreds of thousands of victims, killed, wounded, raped, ethnically cleansed, fleeing sniper bullets cast out as refugees, of a conflict that seemed both resolvable and utterly intractable, depending on the day and whether political risk managers woke up with a clear mind or constipated thinking. I begin this story where my memories are most vivid. The Situation Room, or what its veterans call the Sit Room. Scarcely a day transpires without some mention in the media about this cavernous policy center in the White House. The New York Times reported on just one random day in April 2017 that President Donald Trump removed Mr. Bannon, his chief strategist, from the National Security Council's cabinet-level principals committee. The shift was orchestrated by Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, Mr. Trump's national security advisor, who insisted on purging a political advisor from the Situation Room, where decisions about war and peace are made. CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer and many Hollywood movies and television series have popularized the windowless and now high-tech sanctum of foreign policy making tucked under the West Wing offices of America's most elite power brokers. President Barack Obama invoked the room in his publicly declared love poem to wife Michelle for Valentine's Day 2016. Somebody called the Situation Room because things are about to get hot. Visitors to the Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush presidential libraries see displays of the sit room as it existed during those presidencies and that are now populated by gaggles of suddenly elevated students engaged in simulated crises they must resolve or the world we know will end. No other nation but the United States has so prominently identified where critical issues of foreign and military affairs are deliberated by their leaders, despite the secrecy that envelops the sit room. During the first term of President Bill Clinton, namely 1993 through 1996, I frequented the sit room as Madeleine Albright's senior advisor and counsel, representing the interests of her and the U.S. mission to the United Nations, USUN, which she led as America's permanent representative before her ascent to Secretary of State during Clinton's second term in 1997. I held a slot on the National Security Council, NSC, Deputies Committee, and Albright sat on the Principals Committee, the pinnacle of foreign policy decision-making under the President. I typically would attend as Albright's +1 in the Principals meetings when deputies were invited to join their bosses, but had a chair at the sit-room table behind my nameplate for the more frequent deputies meetings. The Deputies Committee, always led by Deputy National Security Advisor Sandy Berger during those years, was populated by the second highest official in each of the agencies, represented by cabinet officers in the Principals Committee. These deputies included the Deputy Secretaries of the State and Defense Departments, the Deputy Attorney General, the Deputy Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. I had a sui generis identity as Albright's senior advisor and counsel, whom she designated for the meetings, while the officially designated U.S.-UN official on the Deputies Committee, U.S.-UN's ambassador for Special Political Affairs, Carl Rick Inderfirth, rarely could break from his daily duties on the Security Council in New York to attend the White House meetings. But when Inderfirth, a highly talented former journalist for ABC News, joined the deputies either in person or by secure video transmission from New York, I usually sat in the room as his +1. The Balkans conflict of the early 1990s was the major foreign policy test, albeit one among many, during Bill Clinton's first term as president. America's policy gyrations on essentially the Bosnian component of the conflict bred intense criticism, deep skepticism, turbulent moments of hope and despair among officials, enormous carnage and human suffering, and a maddeningly complex peace settlement erected upon a field of shattered proposals. Yet in December 1995, peace was finally achieved, and the Clinton administration took the lion's share of credit for it. But the journey there was rocky, with mistakes and setbacks. While hindsight infuses history with wisdom, living the moment, as we will in the sit-room, also teaches how history unfolds, and decisions fraught with risk are made in real time. This is the story of a 3-year conversation that took place largely at one table in one room, under the more publicly fabled rooms and offices of the White House, as events relentlessly cascaded toward atrocities, land grabs, and political standoffs in the Balkans. There are essentially 3 acts, one each for 1993, 1994, and the 3 scene year of 1995. Each act revealed how repeated failed ventures, as tens of thousands lost their lives and millions were forcibly displaced by ethnic cleansing, preceded the ending of the war with the Dayton peace negotiations in late 1995. Muddling through became the dominant operating principle as the magic bullet to end the imbroglio and prevail with a just settlement, particularly for the Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks, evaded every discussion. This book aims to demonstrate how options were advanced or abandoned at critical moments, and the difference those decisions made in diplomacy and on the ground, particularly in Bosnia. Sit-room veterans kept digging the ditch deeper and deeper. As one of them, I enjoy no immunity from criticism. The often lone advocate of military projection and tough sanctions against the Serbs, my boss, Madeleine Albright, proved to be the most prescient voice at the table. Defense Secretary William Perry was the wise man. Richard Holbrooke, the State Department official who drove the warring parties to a deal at Dayton in 1995, was a force to be reckoned with wherever he set foot. National Security Advisor Tony Lake both frustrated and energized his companions in the sit-room with dogged mind games. Others, including David Gergen as Clinton's seasoned public affairs advisor, were oracles of moral values. The sit-room is an essential but imperfect vessel of policymaking where the human costs tied to critical decisions are never far outside the hermetically sealed door. For 3 years, all eyes turned toward Bill Clinton's Washington for a solution to the Balkans conflict, even though it had started out as Europe's problem, and European nations had committed their troops to the UN peacekeeping mission there. Plans and proposals lay mangled on the sit-room table day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. Why did so many people have to die, or be ethnically cleansed from their towns, waiting for the Americans to decide to act? Yes, really act, to liberate them from their misery. This narrative tries to pin down the answer to that question. I attended almost every deputies meeting and a great number of principals conclaves during the first 4-year term of the Clinton administration. I arrived in the sit-room a few months into 1993 after waiting for the higher security clearance required for work there, and while I toiled at other responsibilities as Albright's advisor in a world full of crises. The Deputies Committee met more frequently than the Principals Committee and made most foreign policy decisions, leaving those that could not be resolved by the deputies, representing their agencies' frequently competing views, for the principals to decide. If there remained gridlock among the principals, the president typically would make a final decision despite the discord below him, which could include remanding it to us for further deliberation. The principals during Clinton's first term were led by the National Security Advisor Anthony Tony Lake and included Secretary of State Warren Christopher, Defense Secretary Les Aspin, and following his resignation in 1994, William Perry, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Army General Colin Powell, and following his retirement in late 1993, Army General John Shalikashvili, Shali, the Director of Central Intelligence James Woolsey, Jr., and upon his retirement in early 1995, John Deutsch, the Vice President's National Security Advisor Leon Firth, Albright, occasionally Attorney General Janet Reno, and Secretary of the Treasury Lloyd Benson, and upon his retirement in late 1994, Robert Rubin, and Berger. Lake and Berger acted mostly as honest brokers among co-equal decision-makers at the sit-room table during principals and deputies meetings, at least in theory. In reality, the Pentagon, represented by both the Defense Department and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, typically brought the clout of vast sums of appropriated money and resources to the sit-room and the unique perspective of military veterans who reminded us that they offered hard-earned experience. The Director of Central Intelligence, or his deputy, often hugged the military point of view after delivering the opening intelligence briefing. I usually could team up with Strobe Talbot, the Deputy Secretary of State, in the deputies' meetings, and at least present a double dose of diplomatic reasoning, and indeed our own experience, to the issue at hand. However, there were times when I presented a third point of view, distinct from Foggy Bottom and the Pentagon, in light of what was occurring at the United Nations in New York, or out in the field with UN peacekeeping operations, or just Albright's bold take on a foreign policy issue. The sit-room was, until significantly renovated in 2006 and 2007, a fairly small, windowless, and wood-paneled room in the lower reaches of the White House that during the 1990s was relatively Spartan in design compared to its current multimedia, multi-screen character and multiple conference rooms of varying size. The room during the 1990s boasted 2 video-linked screens shielded behind wooden pantry doors. There were none of the high-tech visual aids one typically sees portrayed on the old television shows 24 or West Wing, or see in contemporary cinema, or in photographs of the same room today. This story takes place before the expanding and high-tech renovation that occurred during President George W. Bush's second term. In my day there, the sit-room usually squeezed 10 chairs around a heavy wooden conference table. No pictures hung on the wood-paneled walls. We watched one of the TV monitors when Albright or Inderfirth was beamed in from New York over secure lines. One door led to a hallway and out to staircases that took one to the walk-in floor of the West Wing. The other door led to the communications nerve center of the White House. An aide sometimes would walk through that door, bringing the latest cable or news or note from NSC staff to whoever was chairing the meeting. The president or vice president would enter from the other door, the one near the staircase, and all would rise out of respect and wait for him to sit in the leader's chair, with Lake or Berger shifting quickly to another seat at the table. The White House had no Situation Room until 1961, when it was first created by President John F. Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. The space used to be President Harry Truman's bowling alley. Kennedy made ample use of the sit-room during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 to read cable traffic. President Lyndon Johnson spent considerable time strategizing the Vietnam War in the room. President Richard Nixon's National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, likened it to a dungeon. Neither Nixon nor President Gerald Ford made many personal visits to the sit-room, but President George W. Bush's national security team hunkered down in it on September 11, 2001, to manage the initial hours after the terrorist attacks of that day, and he frequented the room. President Barack Obama was known to visit the sit-room often for principals meetings. The renovations completely transformed the room, so it now bears little resemblance to what it looked like during the Clinton administration and the years of policymaking covered by this story. We gazed at television monitors that boasted cathode ray tubes for monitors. We used faxes for communication. We relied on computers and telephones in the White House Communication Center next door, with technology rooted in the 1980s. Cell phones, as we know them today, did not exist, and we could not check our email even in the corridor leading to the sit-room. Indeed, email was still in its infancy. So when we sat at the sit-room table, the only time one's head dipped down was to glance at a hard-copy document or scribble a note with a real pen. Surprisingly, for someone as claustrophobic as me, I found the sit-room to be an inviting arena for decision-making. Surely today, with a much expanded and renovated complex of 3 conference rooms and high-tech control center, officials have spacious quarters in which to remake the world. But in my time, I found that working within a small and relatively tech-free environment can be liberating for the mind, encouraging discourse rather than recourse to electronic feeds. At deputies' meetings, I would sit at the table with the other deputies of the national security agencies. When I attended as Albright's +1 at principals committee meetings, I sat against the wall behind Albright. This had the advantage of being close enough to pass notes or whisper occasionally in her ear, both of which I did only sparingly, as she certainly did not need constant advice, and it would look strange to handicap my principal's stature at the table in that manner. But the disadvantage is that I could not read her facial expressions, which had character and would have signaled certain views of hers to me during the discussion. For some principals' meetings, Albright would beam in on secure video from USUN in New York, and I would occupy a seat either at the sit-room table or against the wall, depending on whether any seat was available at the table, or I felt uncomfortable that day stepping up to the principals' chairs without first being invited by Lake. But when I had the honor to sit among the principals at the table, I felt the burden of policymaking ever more acutely and endeavored to maintain eye contact with whoever was speaking. I always felt I was entering the most important room in Washington, indeed sometimes the world, when I walked through the sit-room door. There the role of America among the peoples of the world would be deliberated that day, and decisions made by either the deputies or the principals, or pitched for ultimate resolution to the President of the United States. We all worked from detailed briefing papers and came prepared, usually, to discuss both the larger issues at stake and the details of risks and policy implementation that are essential to prevailing at the policy table, or at least making a credible argument for one's agency. I would prepare memoranda for Albright prior to her principals' meetings and brief her on where other agencies, including state, stood on the issue of the day. That way she could enter the room with eyes wide open as to what would be advanced by each of her colleagues. It also gave me a chance, within the small world of USUN, to advise her of how I thought policy should be formulated in the sit-room, whether for a deputies or a principals' meeting. That extraordinary opportunity and access constituted some of the most challenging and proudest moments of my professional life. When I sat as the deputy in deputies' committee meetings, I had boundaries within which I spoke to reflect Albright's views and the interests of USUN, while keeping a sharp eye on how Albright fit within the State Department's overall view of the situation. But I could speak independently of state at the table, and sometimes did. For 4 years, 1993 to 1996, I entered the sit-room typically several or more times a week, and as I calculated by early 1997, probably occupied the sit-room more than any other official during the first term of the Clinton administration other than Berger, who chaired the deputies' meetings and joined almost all principals' meetings. Leon Firth, Vice President Al Gore's national security advisor, also was a near-constant voice for Gore in the room. Since USUN's brief covered all foreign policy and national security issues, as they intersected with the United Nations either directly or indirectly, I was on deck daily for sit-room discussions throughout most of those 4 years. The State Department always would be represented too, but that individual could change, depending on the subject being discussed, and the travel or other commitments that would prevent the Deputy Secretary of State from attending deputies' meetings. In visiting the White House so often each week, I enjoyed the 10-minute trek along E Street and then New York Avenue to the residence's south entrance, as that would be the fresh air I needed and time to think before entering the sit-room in its stagnant air. While we could place our cup of coffee or water on the table, I sometimes would sit there wondering when the next cup would be knocked and spill over all the classified papers on the table. I also enjoyed the walk back to state, for once again I inhaled nature's air, maybe absorbed some sunshine, and had time to mentally digest what I had just experienced before reporting back to Albright. A cascade of other issues occupied the deputies within the sit-room during my 4 years at the table, including North Korea and near war in 1994, Somalia, Haiti, Russia, China, arms control, intelligence matters, Rwanda and Central Africa, and the Middle East. Deputies and principals were jerked from one issue to the next, and on many days Bosnia simply was not the highest priority, or it competed greatly with others. So it would be misleading to view discussions about one topic as necessarily reflecting the full reality of the day, as we might shift quickly from one crisis to the next. A meeting on Bosnia might be followed immediately by a meeting on a conflagration elsewhere in the world. Policymakers can easily slip into a what's next psyche about the flow of the day's discussions and decisions, without taking the time to reflect very deeply on what they have just deliberated. In writing this book, I drew primarily upon relevant declassified documents of the Clinton administration that are available, particularly since late 2013, at the Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas, my declassified files, and my personal notebooks. As I did not write down notes while I was speaking in the sit-room, this account avoids trying to reconstruct from memory much of what I personally said, and focuses instead on the interventions of others. The opinions and characterizations in this book are those of the author, and do not necessarily represent the U.S. government. Throughout the years covered in this narrative, my colleagues in the sit-room and I were daily consumers of the journalistic reports from the Balkans. Such outstanding and courageous reporting clearly informed us in real time as we formulated policy. There is a particular focus in this story, however, on other sources of information from diplomatic and intelligence channels that also informed our thinking. The sit-room is not only the most powerful room in Washington, it often bears that title for the world. For precious moments almost every day, the sit-room is a theater in which war and peace compete. The dialogue in that room defines the essence of this book. What follows about the sit-room and Bosnia can shine a light on how other conflicts of subsequent years may have played out in that chamber, with the United States acting quickly and decisively enough to turn the tide of history, or stumbling into pathways of inaction or misunderstandings about erupting events in foreign lands. Those entering the sit-room face this reality, that people in peril will survive with hope or slide deeper into despair, depending upon what officials decide over the next few hours in that historic room to uphold the integrity of America's place in the world. Setting the stage. Take what you know about the American Civil War of the early 1860s, the unimaginable violence, racial oppression, and secessionist fervor, and imagine what could transpire across the Atlantic Ocean in Eastern Europe 130 years later, where these three phenomena, ethnic and religious replacing racial, erupted into a war between and within nations and among peoples that also lasted 4 years. So much unified the citizens of the United States, only to see the entire edifice of American society begin to collapse when Fort Sumter was bombarded on April 12 to 13, 1861. Fast forward to 1991. People who had been living and working together, attending schools and universities as fellow students, intermarrying, serving as comrades in the Yugoslav army throughout the Cold War, and creating music and theater and dinner together, were suddenly torn asunder into three ethnic groups defined by their religious and political affiliations: the Bosnian Muslims, Bosniaks, the Croatian Roman Catholics, and the Serbian Orthodox Christians. Two newly formed countries following the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1991 bore the brunt of the war: Bosnia and Herzegovina and its northern neighbor Croatia, while Serbia-Montenegro fueled the conflict. Like the end of colonialism after World War II and the liberation of long-submerged nations, the Soviet Empire was dissembling into newly formed countries across Europe and Asia. Self-determination, in its many guises, was on the march again. So Yugoslavia's breakup was not that surprising. But Western Europe's old guard and the United States, always the distracted superpower, were not expecting the violence that rapidly swept over Croatia in 1991 and over Bosnia starting in 1992. The triggering of wars are complex unravelings of societies. But one can point to a single speech by rising Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic on June 28, 1989, in the Muslim-dominated Serbian province of Kosovo at Gazimastan, a Serbian memorial commemorating the Battle of Kosovo of 1389. There, the Serb army fought the invading Ottoman army to a standstill, but with such catastrophic losses that the Ottoman Empire, with far more forces to draw upon, ultimately seized control of the Serbian region. At Gazimastan, Milosevic lit the fires of ethnic hatred and Serb superiority by stoking the will to fight for a unified Serb country. What was political opportunism for Milosevic became socially devastating for the people of much of Yugoslavia. The first brutal violence was unleashed by the Yugoslav army against the Croatian cities of Vukovar in the east and Dubrovnik, a treasured UNESCO World Heritage Site on the Mediterranean Sea. Most of Vukovar was bombed into rubble, and an estimated 1,131 civilians killed there. About 1,800 Croatian troops battled 36,000 Serb forces. Atrocities swept through the city as the Serbs destroyed it. The iconic Croatian seaside city of Dubrovnik and its old town buildings of architectural splendor and historical significance suffered heavy damage from Serb shellings. More than 80 civilians were killed and 11,000 buildings damaged during the many days of artillery strikes in late 1991, including 13 civilians killed on December 2nd to 3rd, 1991, when the fiercest bombardments hit the old town. The Serbs eventually seized control of large regions of Croatian territory along the northern border of Bosnia and inserted puppet governments ruled by local Serbs. Bosnia's plunge for independence on March 3, 1992, outraged the leaders of Serbia and Croatia and their brethren on Bosnian soil who were seeking their respective union with either Mother Croatia or Mother Serbia. A ferocious war ensued in Bosnia. The ethnic cleansing of more than 2 million people, mostly Bosniaks and in smaller numbers Bosnian Croats, had occurred by mid-1992, with little, if any, regard for the constraints of international law. In fact, ethnic cleansing came of age during the Balkans War. The term means the forcible displacement of a population, typically sharing common ethnic or religious origins, from its native territory and often using tactics that constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or even genocide. In the prosecution of ethnic cleansing, which is a colloquial term, tribunals examine the crime of persecution. Detention camps proliferated in Bosnia as bastions of torture, rape, and murder. A large number of atrocities in the Balkans War had occurred during 1991 and 1992, and the crimes that continued across Bosnia in later years, culminating in the genocide at Srebrenica, were hideous extensions of the brutality. The administration of the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, still basking in its defeat of Saddam Hussein and liberation of Kuwait, responded meekly to the carnage in the hard-to-fathom Balkans. European powers agreed to send troops for the newly created UN Peacekeeping Protection Force, UNPROFOR, to be stationed in both Bosnia and Croatia, but that hardly stopped the Bosnian Serb assault that ethnically cleansed huge swaths of Bosnia for the Serbian cause. By January 20, 1993, when the Clinton administration took over the reins of power in Washington, at least 45,300 people, mostly civilians, had been killed. Almost 3 million Bosniaks and Croats had been cleansed from their homes and towns in Bosnia and Croatia, and Bosnian Serb forces controlled 70% of Bosnia's territory, compared to 10% held by the Bosniaks and 20% occupied by the Bosnian Croats. In Croatia, about 30% of the territory was controlled by Croatian Serb militia. Ahead were 3 years of jousting between war and peace in the Balkans, although most of this story will center on the Bosnian part of the conflict, where atrocities proliferated as American policymakers grappled with its nearly unyielding challenges in the sit room. 1. Shattered Plans, 1993. The world has let a terrible thing happen in Bosnia, but I always have been very reluctant to use American ground forces, and I am sure Bill Clinton will be unless we have absolute objectives. Al Gore. This policy legitimizes ethnic cleansing. Madeleine Albright.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?